Thanks for coming. I'm very excited to be here and to give my first ever Polyglot Gathering presentation. So, first of all, yes, that title is a meme. So I'm very glad that earned a click from you to see my presentation. And before we begin, it's very important that I give you a content warning because this presentation may contain foul language in Cantonese and English. So if you're sensitive to that, I'm sorry, but I think you might have to stay away from this one. But for the rest of you, I am Israel Lai. I am a student in music composition by day and a polyglot language learner by night. But usually it's the other way around. So I do most music at night. I have a blog called Rhapsody in Lingo and a YouTube channel of the same name where I make videos about my language learning, about general language knowledge. Sometimes I make vlogs about my life in UK and travels, but that is mainly for the sake of the Cantonese learning community. So I put Cantonese subtitles on them, more on that later. And I have a podcast in Cantonese about linguistics. So if you understand Cantonese, please come to listen to our podcast. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. So let's get into the topic. First of all, we have a short clip from classic Hong Kong cinema. And listen to this tiny clip and tell me how many languages do you spot when you read or listen to this video?
阻人哋搏嘢，死咗要俾人燒春袋㗎。Oh, sorry，轉翻個英文台。Do remember, you disturb me fucking, your spring pocket will be barbecue that girl.
Yeah, so there's the foul language, and I'm sorry about that. But anyway, so what language was spoken? That was Cantonese, and congratulations for guessing it. What language was in the subtitles? That is standard written Chinese, as we call it. And then this guy proceeds to switch to English in a very weird Hong Kong style that doesn't really mean much in English. And that was also subtitled in Chinese. So this pretty much summarizes the linguistic situation in Hong Kong, which is something called Diglossia. And if you're not familiar, Diglossia means we speak in one language and write in another. So more on Diglossia in Hong Kong in the following. So first of all, what is Cantonese? So this is the Sinitic language family, or some people call it Chinese languages. If you go down to the left, you see Northern Chinese languages and then Mandarin. Underneath Mandarin is Standard Chinese or Putonghua that most people learn when they learn Chinese. But if you go to the right, you see Southern languages, you see Yue, which is a big branch of Sinitic. And then under that, you have Cantonese, which is the language that is spoken in Hong Kong and some other parts of Guangdong. So how is Cantonese written? Well, throughout the history of Chinese languages, people wrote in classical Chinese, which is basically ancient Chinese written down. So nobody actually spoke that language while they were writing it. In the early 20th century, that was replaced with standard written Chinese, which is a writing standard that is mostly based on Mandarin in terms of syntax and vocabulary. And basically, it's now taught to speakers of all the Sinitic languages, whether you come from which part of China, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, or if you're abroad. Whereas Cantonese can be written down. It's considered a relatively new thing, but actually it was first recorded in the 1700s. And then throughout Hong Kong's history as a British colony, it was developed for informal communication, especially because of the societal and cultural distance from mainland China. And it's particularly important in transcribing when the accuracy is important. So Cantonese is written in both ways for different contexts. And since Hong Kong was handed to China, to the People's Republic of China in 1997, we have a policy called trilingualism and biliteracy. So trilingualism means children in school are taught to speak Cantonese, English, and Mandarin. And biliteracy means we are taught to write in standard written Chinese and English. So you might notice that written Cantonese doesn't even enter the question. So it's just taken for granted that Cantonese cannot be written, is never written, at least not in any proper capacity, even though it is actually. And most people, because of this upbringing, translate between Cantonese, spoken Cantonese and written Chinese very fluently and naturally. Just the same way that we might have to change some parts of English when we write it down, except obviously the distance is much greater. It's a different language altogether. And to some people, it is so natural, so automatic that they just can't stop doing it. I've got a fun example here. Some guy on Twitter tweeted something relatively radical. So he was saying he thinks that we should just ditch written Chinese altogether. And not just that, also ditch any form of written Chinese, including Cantonese, just all of it. Get rid of it. So that's very crazy. But the best part is this is written in standard written Chinese, not Cantonese. So I don't get it. He's against written Chinese, but he writes in it. So it's just natural for us to do this. And then now I'm going to introduce a thing that I call Hong Kong Chinese, which is just going to be my name for it through the rest of this presentation. And Hong Kong Chinese is basically standard written Chinese pronounced in Cantonese. So you can imagine it's like cognates. Just for example, imagine if you read French in English, but you use the equivalent in English. So like when you see information, you would say information. So that kind of thing. Hong Kong Chinese also incorporates some Cantonese characteristics in terms of vocabulary, sometimes maybe word order and grammar. But all in all, it's a spectrum. So the way you write can vary from more Mandarin, more standard written Chinese, to more Cantonese. And this spectrum, depending on where it is, it might look very strange to people who speak Mandarin. So for example, I got a tiny text from Apple Podcasts. That's actually from the page of my podcast. The first one is from the Hong Kong page, which translates to show more 10 episodes. And the second one is from the Taiwan page, and it says further show 10 episodes. So the first one is actually ungrammatical in Mandarin, but it's written in Hong Kong Chinese and on the Apple page. Hong Kong Chinese is spoken in lots of formal situations, including education, especially when we're reading things aloud, including documents, including reading books aloud directly, when we read the Bible, etc. It's used in Canto-Pop, which is pop music sung in Hong Kong. We actually don't sing in Cantonese, we sing in Hong Kong Chinese, which is basically Mandarin, pronounced in Cantonese. And more importantly, subtitles. So why are subtitles a question that's worth discussing? Because subtitles rarely ever transcribe what's being said word for word, because that would be a transcript and that would be very verbose. In any language, subtitles have to make it a bit more concise. But in terms of Hong Kong Chinese, it's even more so because it's actually a translation of the spoken dialogue. So there is some rephrasing involved. Sometimes some elements, some spoken elements are removed, such as mood. So actually, not only is the actor speaking, but whoever makes the subtitles also has a voice in the dialogue. So throughout our story, we're going to be looking at the balance between faithfulness, like a transcript, and ease of reading, which is conciseness. And let's go back in time to the golden age of Hong Kong cinema, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, because that was when films were widely exported to overseas audiences. Back then, the subtitles were mostly in Hong Kong Chinese, but they were relatively liberal with their inclusion of Cantonese elements, such as the mood particles and whatever I mentioned earlier. And there were usually English subtitles, but more on that later. So let's look at this, another classic clip from As Tears Go By.
着西裝打呔，攞大哥電話有咩用啊？啊？跟啲咁嘅大佬，吔屎啊你！
Okay, depending on how much you understand Cantonese, you may or may not have noticed that there is an English loanword in that clip, which is tie. That comes from necktie. That means a necktie. This is a character and a word that is only in Cantonese. It doesn't exist in Mandarin, but it was retained in the subtitles. And the last sentence, which is actually sort of a meme in Hong Kong, translates to "eat shit la you." That is a structure unique to Cantonese because Mandarin cannot put the subject at the very end of the sentence. And also, when it comes to the verb, he says "ya," which is a Cantonese word, but the subtitles changed it to "sing," which is also a relatively Cantonese word, but that character exists in written Chinese, so that's why the subtitles picked that word instead of the one that was actually said, because "ya" doesn't exist in Mandarin at all. Another example from classic cinema is Queen of Temple Street, which was very shocking because this is almost completely in Cantonese in terms of the subtitles. So, for example, this line, that's very, very, very Cantonese. But the thing is, it's not completely faithful either. Sometimes they skip some things, they rephrase a lot of the dialogue, and sometimes the subtitles randomly cut out. So I don't know what's that there. But that was a surprise to me that back in the 90s, Cantonese subtitles were a thing. And let's talk about the English subtitles, because these are the ones you understand. This is also another classic clip that you might want to focus on the English subtitles here. So this is a sort of a poetry competition where one person sets up a rhyme and the other one is supposed to respond to that rhyme.
一鄉二里共三夫，只不識四書五經六義，竟敢教七八九子，十分大膽。對啊，做咩唔對啊？咁唔俾面！
Okay, yeah, so you can see that those subtitles make no sense at all because they have nothing to do with what the person was saying. And obviously that's poetry, so basically whoever made the subtitles just gave up. But just to a less extreme degree, English subtitles in classic cinema were sort of just lackluster or even just hilarious and funny, because I suspect they're not intended to be read because they don't actually tell the story completely. They sort of help you follow a bit, but in general, I think they're just there for the sake of being there. And I surmise that it may be because they want to show that this is Hong Kong cinema, and Hong Kong is a place where we use English. So they just have English subtitles there. And all in all, it's mainly just a convention that the people followed, and convention is very important in this story. Now, because of this legacy, pop culture was sort of shaped by classic cinema and TV as well. And after the decline of Hong Kong cinema, especially in terms of export, television took over as the main form of local entertainment and export. For example, in the largest broadcaster TVB, the subtitles tend to be more proper Chinese, and even actually the spoken language, the spoken dialogue, tends to be more literary compared to film. And I think that might be because TV generally is more family friendly. It's when the whole family sits down at dinner and watches together, compared to the cinema experience, which is more gritty or sometimes a bit more colloquial, funny, and for adults. The television subtitles are generally monolingual, just in Chinese, and that Chinese is even less flexible than the ones that we just saw. So they are sort of swaying towards the more standardized, more concise written Chinese instead of the more faithful Cantonese subtitles. And this gradually became a convention, and that convention lasts until today, when subtitles are almost always there and they're always burnt in, which means they are in part of the picture and you can't turn them off compared to, for example, Netflix. And subtitles are an important resource for kids like me who are learning vocabulary, learn lots of words from subtitles. And from my first-hand experience of running a YouTube channel, I can tell you that the viewers do complain if you make a video without subtitles. They're like, that's so weird. Where are the subtitles? And you might be wondering, do we actually read them? And I can't really answer that question, but I think yes. But we're not depending on the subtitles to follow along. It's more like a listening aid. for us to help us follow what's being said, to get all that's being said. And this culture also becomes part of everyone's habit to read subtitles when they're watching videos and films. And even though many people advise against reading subtitles when you're learning a foreign language, I still do that because it just feels weird without subtitles, even when I watch like Polish TV, for example. And so this culture has a huge impact on the pop culture. So the first example is capto, which means screenshots or screen grabs. So we like to grab screen grabs from movies and use them as memes. There is a huge Facebook page or multiple pages that specialize in posting screen grabs from films and TV with the subtitles. And I think in our internet culture, we use these screen grabs in a way similar to English-speaking culture uses GIFs, except these screen grabs are really easy to produce because, for one, they're static, and also the text is already inside the screenshot, so you don't have to add it yourself. So, for example, you have this one from classic Hong Kong film, which says, literally, "Are you trying to be bigger than me?" So trying to scare me like a dog. Another one from television. So you can see that this one is monolingual without English. And so if you read Chinese, then you notice that the second one is more familiar to Mandarin speakers. When we use these memes, sometimes we read them aloud as they're written. So in written Chinese. Sometimes we may remember how the original dialogue was spoken, or maybe we just mentally translate it from the screenshot, from the subtitles, back into the spoken Cantonese. And you can trust me when I say that it's really common to quote these lines inside daily conversation, especially this one, which means it's an illusion, you can't scare me. Another part of subtitle culture is the expressive element, because writing in Chinese and written Chinese is translation for Cantonese speakers, and translation is inherently expressive. So the translator makes some changes where they feel like it's appropriate. For example, in this meme, this guy originally says, "Why is that person so ugly?" Because our pronouns are gender neutral. But the subtitles actually say, "A lass who is so ugly." And I chose the word lass because this character, Nao in Cantonese, is a northern Chinese colloquialism in Mandarin. And this word is just not used in Cantonese at all. Sometimes it just means a girl. Sometimes it's a bit demeaning. So that's an extra layer of meaning that the translator added to the subtitles. And another one that I want to talk about is humor, because one type of humor follows this logic. Because the subtitles don't match what's being spoken anyway, so why not try to take it one step further? And there is one type of humor that's called 口不對心, which means the mouth doesn't match the heart or the mind. So it sort of dramatizes the dynamic between what you say to people in terms of politeness and what you actually think in your mind. And this YouTuber in particular is very famous for doing this. So, for example, in this screenshot, he's commenting on the video of celebrities singing Imagine to help us deal with the pandemic. I'm sure you all remember that video. He says that it fills him with power when he listens to the music. But subtitles actually say it makes him want to die. So that's what he actually thinks when he says the polite part of it. And subtitles are full of swear words and expletives because that's what people usually think in their minds, I think. Sometimes he even puts subtitles for his facial expressions to tell you what he's thinking when he makes certain faces, like, yeah. So this kind of humor is completely dependent on the habit of reading and listening at the same time. And that might be demanding to read and listen to different things if people are not already used to reading subtitles. Another kind of humor is based on the bad English subtitles that I showed you earlier, and that takes it to the extreme. So, for example, this cooking YouTuber, he's making ceramics, and his subtitles say really random things. Basically, tells you if I don't fail, then you wouldn't watch my video. So it has nothing to do with the spoken word at all, just random English words. So obviously, they're not for English speakers to follow. They're just for Cantonese speakers who are watching the video for a bit of a laugh. And obviously, it requires the reader or the viewer to be able to read subtitles in 2 languages at the same time, while also listening to the Cantonese that's being said. Now, one step forward towards Cantonese subtitles, but I put the word back here because, as I said earlier, Cantonese subtitles were a thing in the 90s. They just stopped being a thing into the 21st century. So written Cantonese were mainly used in transcriptions, and it was used in newspapers for direct quotes from interviewees as well. But gradually in the 21st century, more tabloids and newspaper columns write entirely in Cantonese. Online forums are generally in Cantonese. We text people and write Facebook posts in Cantonese. Funny story, Facebook keeps showing me the memories of posts from a decade ago, and I was completely unaware that 10 years ago I always wrote in written Chinese, but now I'm just completely unable to do that, and it just feels so weird. And also, Cantonese is used in advertising, because when you speak to someone in their language, it goes to their heart. So that's what advertisers want. There is Cantonese literature, which started on these online forums. It would later get published as books. And also more recently, there is a literary magazine called Weiheng, which focuses on Cantonese literature and not Hong Kong Chinese. But still, written Cantonese is strictly forbidden in sort of official documents. It's just never used. People feel like it's not for that purpose. And as we get to this point, I'd like to make a distinction between talking about subtitling in Cantonese and writing in Cantonese in general, because writing is an expressive medium, whereas subtitles have a greater responsibility to reflect what's being spoken on screen, especially if it's intended for deaf or hard of hearing people, or to help people follow what's being said, or for learners of the language to know the words. So subtitles have to be more accurate compared to writing. And with the advent of internet video like YouTube, we have a new and democratic medium, which means every YouTuber, every creator can decide how to best represent themselves on this medium. So their choice of language will depend on their attitude towards the languages, the target audience, or how the audience thinks about Cantonese and written Chinese. Sometimes they might also appeal to some associations that come from the legacy. So for example, maybe written Chinese for more proper dialogue, and Cantonese for more casual and comfortable conversations. So here I'd like to use a metaphor from a friend of mine, which is making a cake. So the base is one language, whereas you put the sprinkles on top of the cake. So in terms of many YouTubers nowadays, the cake base is written Chinese in the subtitles, but sometimes they use Cantonese as a sprinkles for some expressive elements, and sometimes English for some loan words that are very commonly used in Cantonese, that they are irreplaceable. So for example, this another cooking YouTuber who does vlogs in the UK, her subtitles are mainly using standard Chinese particles, but sometimes she uses certain content words from Cantonese. For example, me, which means to carry on your back, which is unique to Cantonese. But I'd like to draw attention to the subtitles. I'm sorry, not the titles, not subtitles on the screen, which are these. These are not subtitles. These are expressive titles on top of the subtitles. And this one says, it's coming. This one says, the food is here. And these are all in pure Cantonese. And I think it's because she's treating the subtitles and the titles differently. Subtitles have an informational purpose, whereas titles are more expressive, which is why she chose to use Cantonese in the titles and written Chinese in the subtitles. And not only these people, there is currently a new wave of vloggers and YouTubers from Hong Kong because of the huge emigration wave from Hong Kong. So many people who emigrated to, for example, the UK are making YouTube channels in hopes of capitalizing on the next batch of immigrants. So many of these YouTubers are low budget, and you can see that from the tendencies they might have in their channels. So generally, I noticed that many of them are not subbed because they don't have the resources or the know-how to do it, or the time. Many of the subtitles are in Hong Kong Chinese instead of Cantonese, and usually they're hard subs, which matches the legacy, the convention. For example, this young YouTuber is in the UK. He writes in pure Hong Kong Chinese, so not many Cantonese elements here. Whereas this one is more interesting because it's mainly in written Cantonese and it's soft subtitles. But sometimes she rephrases the subtitles to remove some syllables, to remove the subject pronoun, because we generally do that in Chinese languages. But when she says an incomplete sentence, she doesn't change the phrase structure to make it more coherent. So it's more faithful in that sense. And generally, she uses Cantonese characters. But with some characters that are harder to type, she replaces them with some replacements that are common in Cantonese. And sometimes she replaces them with the standard Chinese equivalents, which are different words altogether. It might be because to some people, writing in Cantonese is easier because it means you don't have to translate it into a different language. With standard Chinese, you might have to find equivalents to certain words that are very typical Cantonese. But at the same time, if a person is brought up or currently in a language environment that favors Hong Kong Chinese, then they might find it actually easier to write in that way because they might struggle to find the right way to write Cantonese. And this might depend on the age. When I look at these new YouTubers, a lot of them, they're quite diverse in age, but on average, I think they are older than existing YouTubers because many of them have just arrived in foreign countries with their families and they're making videos while they hunt for jobs. And they're generally more amateur and they value quantity of videos over the quality. So they don't spend a lot of time making subtitles, which may influence their attitude towards making them. So what subtitles do different age groups read or write in general? I think from my observation, middle-aged people grew up in an era when written Cantonese was less common, but at the same time, they were not as close towards Chinese culture because of the political situation. People of my age experienced the switch from written Chinese to written Cantonese, as I mentioned, and there is little influence from Mandarin-speaking culture in our daily life. So we're sort of the best at writing Cantonese, whereas younger people may feel more proximity towards pop cultures from China or Taiwan, which speak Mandarin. So they're more familiar with that medium. Currently, I see that the number of channels with Cantonese subtitles seem to be on the rise. But there are still a lot of channels that stick to the tradition of Hong Kong Chinese, regardless of age. And most of them have sort of a mixture, just like in the classic films. And in terms of TV, on the other end of things, they are standing strong and they're sticking to written Chinese because they want to appear more proper as a huge institution. So how can we look at these new developments? I think we look at them in terms of adapting the convention or subverting it. So we can think about what's changeable and what's unchangeable. how much change can be added to this tradition, or how quickly can this tradition be changed, and whether these associations are fixed. For example, does written Cantonese mean you're more casual and colloquial? So if we look at large productions, for example, from Disney Plus has the option of Chinese Hong Kong. And of course, they are optional subtitles because they're American productions. And generally, it means they are the classic mix of written Chinese and written Cantonese. And the end result is alien to anyone who watches it, regardless of what language you speak. So, for example, if you look at the first episode of The Simpsons, the pleasantries are predominantly spoken. So they but they're also polite. So they're in the middle. There is a bit of Cantonese elements. There are some written Chinese elements. Exclamations are very expressive. For example, this one says, "Bart, our son is so cute." So that's very expressive, and it's in pure Cantonese. Whereas when you sing, just like in Cantopop, the subtitles are in written Chinese. So in contrast to that, some smaller studios and productions may have more room for experimentation in their subtitles. Most notably, a recent film called The Way We Keep Dancing became, I think, known as the first modern era film to come with purely Cantonese subtitles. And that's a big deal because the subtitles are burnt into the picture. So it's sort of in your face. So it's making a statement that we want to use this language in our subtitles. But outside of this film, the mainstream, most films are still in the mixture that we talked about. If we look at YouTube, we see, for example, this YouTuber called Chris Wong, who is used to be a news anchor in Hong Kong, but now he's moved to the UK and he runs a news channel on YouTube. He's got 4 main video series. First one is News Post, which is a news report. Newsroom, which is news commentary. A Little Record, where he interviews notable figures. And Vlog Around the Clock, where he vlogs and also does some street interviews with people on the streets. So if you look at A Little Record, for example, this one where he interviews a very well-known activist, Nathan Law, the subtitles are in written Chinese. Whereas when he interviews people on the streets, subtitles are in Cantonese, which is really interesting because they're on the same channel from the same creator. So I think these choices are sending a message. So maybe he feels like using written Chinese makes the video sound more serious, more, maybe deeper, whereas the written Cantonese subtitles feel more casual and more day-to-day. At the same time, I also think that written Chinese subtitles build a distance between the viewer and the interviewee. So there is more respect involved towards this one particular person. Whereas in the street interviews, you're intended to relate to the interviewees because they're just normal people like you. So written Cantonese. So in general, Cantonese is written for a sense of intimacy, whereas Hong Kong Chinese is for legitimacy. For example, if you look at a group channel on YouTube, they generate in written Chinese, but if one of the members has their own solo channel, so it's more, proper, less proper, less large, so that would be that might be in written Cantonese instead of written Chinese. So there's a huge contrast there. So the last question is, where do Cantonese subtitles go from here? So recently, there are some new technologies that make it much easier to make Cantonese subtitles. For example, Subbanana is a service that transcribes and creates subtitles for Cantonese videos and audio as well. And there is another one called PY Transcriber, which is multilingual and uses a Google API. It can transcribe Cantonese audio. And these tools are very, very precious because in software development and in natural language processing, Cantonese is very often overlooked because it's seen as a small language or a subsidiary of Chinese. Even when it comes to translation software, even with languages that are smaller in terms of number of speakers, or languages with written material that are less rich than Cantonese, which means it should be harder to make a translator. There are translation services for those languages, but not for Cantonese. Even Google Translate has a contribute function for many years already, but Cantonese is still nowhere to be found in their services. And the problem with Cantonese subtitles now is that we have no convention to follow. So we don't know what Cantonese subtitles can or should look like, and how faithful we should go with the subtitles. And these languages are entangled because we are brought up to think that these are the one and the same language, and we read Standard Chinese fluently, and we even sometimes use Chinese vocabulary in Cantonese. So how do we separate them? There are several ways to go. We can leave the entire cinematic legacy behind us. We can maintain some Hong Kong Chinese in our subtitles in specific circumstances, sort of a reversal of how Cantonese was treated, or we can maintain the status quo. The hardest part is the vocabulary, because we have to delineate the vocabulary into Hong Kong Chinese and Cantonese. Because traditionally, only just colloquial and very casual vocabulary was treated as Cantonese. But if we did it that way, that means written Cantonese can only be colloquial and casual, and words that are in Mandarin cannot be Cantonese. So obviously the answer is something in between. And more recently, the use of language, or the choices in language, are increasingly politicized, because the situation in Hong Kong, if you use one language when another is expected, for example, in subtitles, you are making a political statement. At the same time, using subtitles in Cantonese may encourage the use of written Cantonese in other contexts as well, because it builds a familiarity, and it may legitimize this language as a written language. So at the end of the day, it's not a practical problem, but rather just a matter of your attitude towards the languages. So last but not least, what is my take then? How should we move forward? I think we need to build a new convention, a convention of written Cantonese, the same way that written Chinese was built from Mandarin, but of course based it on Cantonese. The most important part is to make it concise. So we may retain particles, retain only particles that influence the meaning, but remove ones that are only for mood and don't actually affect the meaning of the sentence. And if we repeat something when we're speaking, we may cut it out so as to make the subtitles more readable. And in terms of vocabulary, we need to level the playing field between the different registers, different kinds of vocabulary. So the most important thing is to destigmatize so-called colloquial vocabulary and make it usable in more contexts. And we can start by dividing vocabulary into different registers, just like every language has different registers. So more formal registers may have more literary vocabulary, but at the end of the day, we still maintain them, we treat them equally, we just use them in different contexts for different flavors of language. So that's all. May have overrun a bit, but thank you very much for listening. You can come to my language and user website to check out the things I do. And on my channel, all my stuff is subtitled, especially the Cantonese videos are subtitled in written Cantonese in the way that I think it should be. So I am now starting to read the questions. It's got pretty long questions. So the first one, how did the shift from classical to modern standard written Chinese happen in Hong Kong, considering that it was under British control at the time? Oh, very good question. So we always we share the literary history with mainland China, even though the social history is separated. So we read things from mainland China in written Chinese, and so that the influence came from there, and we just treated written Chinese as the more proper form, especially since especially in Sinitic languages, people always want to reach the biggest audience possible. So they always want to learn the form of language that most people read and write. So we did the same around that time, but they always happened in parallel. Only that formal language, books and news and everything, they shifted to written Chinese. So the main point is we're not completely cut off, culturally speaking. Second question, are there active attempts to get written Cantonese in official documents? Yes, absolutely. I know a lot of language activists who are trying to do this. I don't have much influence, so I can't do anything. But there is, for example, a celebrity figure now, I think, who started out as a linguist, but he started doing sort of language-related shows on TV, and now he's his personality now. So sometimes he tries to write written Cantonese in contexts that it's not expected, where it feels wrong. For example, he most famously wrote, what's that called? A rental contract in written Cantonese, which was a huge thing back then. But still, the tradition is so ingrained that there's not much that can be done quickly to change it. But I think the good thing is that there is more and more awareness among the general population of the possibility that Cantonese has. For example, with the literary magazine that I mentioned earlier. So more and more people are writing just Cantonese in their day-to-day lives with their text and so on, and exposing people, for example, older people who are not used to reading Cantonese, exposing them to this form of language and the things that it can do. So maybe in the distant future, there may be a shift towards written Cantonese in more contexts. But because of the political situation, that might hit another hurdle, because schools, as always, they are against writing Cantonese in any form, especially in exams. We were always penalized for using any Cantonese words inside our writing. And I imagine that in the future, it's going to be the same, or even more aggressively. Last question, are you promoting the substitution of Romanized Cantonese pronunciation to any forms of Chinese characters? No, I think that is too much of a shift to effect, because there is a matter of, ideology, and there's the other thing of practicality. And even if we completely replace written Chinese with written Cantonese, that's still not as big of a change, because they have a lot in common. And as you might know, the characters don't denote the exact pronunciation. So if a pair of words are cognates in Mandarin and Cantonese, they look the same in the different languages. So when we shift from writing standard Chinese to writing Cantonese, we are only replacing the parts that are Mandarin. So it's much easier. Whereas if you replace it completely with Romanization, first of all, very, very few people know or use any form of standardized Romanization in their daily lives. Basically, only educators and linguists. And also, you have to build a new reading habit from the ground up in order to comprehend this new writing language completely. Of course, there's the problem of homophones. So that's another hurdle. But we can look at how, for example, Mongolia and Kazakhstan are doing, and then decide what to go from there. But generally, I think we just go with whatever is best for the population and is easiest for the people to express themselves, because language is just a tool. What you're trying to say is way more important. So I think that's all of the questions. Thank you very much again. And yeah, I hope you come to check out the stuff, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the gathering. Bye.